Hello, and welcome to my favorite type of episode of Zilog and Moto, and that's one where I'm reviewing a game that before this week I knew nothing about. Now, sometimes that ends up with an awesome game like Decap Attack, which ends up being the absolute definition of the term hidden gem, and then sometimes, well, you get DJ Boy, and probably the less said about that one the better. If you're not familiar with Zilog and Moto, and this is your first time here, welcome, and I hope you enjoy the show. My name is Dave, and behind me you see the wall of Sega. My goal is to collect complete copies of every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if you can play it with a Genesis and potentially an add-on, and I can read what's on the screen, I've got it in my crosshairs. And after my last trip to Atlanta, I'm only missing about 300 out of 1,280 or so titles, with a good portion of those being European releases. But I didn't want to just collect all these games, I also wanted to do something constructive with them, to celebrate these games, good and bad. So I came up with this channel to review each and every one of these games, with new reviews coming every week or so. Getting back to the subject of this week's review, Bonanza Brothers is an even more obscure game to me than the two other games that I mentioned in the intro in Decap Attack and DJ Boy. For both of those titles, it's true I had never played either game before I reviewed them in episodes 88 and 119 respectively, so I didn't really know what I was getting into with those titles prior to those review weeks. However, to say I knew nothing about those titles might not be true depending on your definition of the term nothing. You see, I was definitely aware of the existence of both games, even if I didn't know how the games played or what they were about. For Decap Attack, I had long seen the game advertised in various magazines, and also on the shelves at Electronics Boutique, so I was well aware that it was some type of platformer with a somewhat creepy main character. And for DJ Boy, even though I didn't know what the game was about or even what kind of game it was, for whatever reason, it was advertised pretty regularly in the mail order ads and magazines, right along with other games with eye-catching titles that never made it to the United States like 3x3 Eyes. In the case of Bonanza Brothers, however, I'm at a complete loss because somehow before I started collecting, I knew nothing about this game. It never made a dent in my psyche. Now, I'm sure 30 years ago, I probably did see some mention of the game in a magazine at some point. For whatever reason though, with a relatively nondescript name like Bonanza Brothers, it just didn't make an impact. Compounding matters is the fact that Bonanza Brothers is actually a port of a Sega System 24 arcade game that is at best uncommon, with it currently having a 3 out of 100 rating on KLOV's rating scale. However, Galloping Ghost, the best arcade in the world, does apparently have a machine on site, so I'll probably have to head over there soon to check it out. Why did Bonanza Brothers, or technically Bonanza Bros, fail to make a dent in the arcades in 1990? And how does the Genesis version hold up to the arcade version, seeing as how that's actually what I'm reviewing today? Is it worth playing and seeking out as potentially a hidden gem of the library? Or is there a reason why it's somewhat forgotten about in 2023, other than making the occasional appearance in a Sega collection on modern consoles? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Bonanza Brothers for the Genesis. This copy's in pretty decent shape on the outside, no hang tab at the top, but at least it was removed cleanly, and the inner cover is held up well also. I think I've had it in the collection for a while now. Honestly, I can't remember when I picked it up. As mentioned in the intro, it's not the most common game in the world, but it's also not terribly valuable either, with complete copies currently going for between $35 and $40 on price charting. You might not run across it in your local shop necessarily, but there's more than a few copies on eBay right now if you happen to see this review and decide you want to pick up one. As far as the front cover goes, I like it. It's a black box title with an old-timey style wanted poster showing the Bonanza Brothers, and then the title logo at the bottom in the same block font at the top to match the poster. However, having the Bonanza Brothers in a wanted poster does raise some questions due to an odd storyline change that was inserted into the game for North American release of the home version, and I'll get to that in a minute. For comparison's sake, here's the Japanese and European covers, and just to note, the Japanese version was the first version of the game released, coming out in May of 1991, and then it was followed by the North American version that October, and then finally hit Europe in November. Both the Japanese and European versions try to reference the arcade version a bit more directly, with both games referring to the name of the game as Bonanza Bros instead of Bonanza Brothers, complete with both utilizing the same logo from the original arcade machine, and the Japanese version having the blimp used by the Bros in the game at the top of the artwork. If you look closely at the Japanese version, you can see what would become the cover art of the European version in the background, serving as the Japanese version of the wanted poster. All in all, I do think the American version has the best cover, because while the Japanese version is a bit too busy for my taste, the European version, with just the minimalist representation of the brothers, is pretty rough, and I've got a hard time believing someone at Sega Europe approved it looking like that. It's almost as if it was put in as a placeholder cover, and then they simply forgot or didn't care enough to change it to something better before shipping it. Flipping over the back, and there's a pretty standard rear Genesis layout from the era, with 3 very good quality screenshots, and considering the art style used in the game, they definitely needed those pictures to look as good as possible. The flavor text, however, well, that's your first sign that something has gone very sideways with the game. Check out this last section here. Don't let the bad guys make your life miserable. Call the good guys. We might slip on banana peels, but bash 'em and smash 'em. What? To be clear, avoiding banana peels is a part of the game, but I don't understand. Why are the Bonanza brothers on a wanted poster on the front cover if they're the good guys? And who exactly are they bashing and smashing? Opening up the case, and the manual is a little bit bent up, but overall it's intact. The manual isn't very thick, really only consisting of about 9 pages of instructions, but that's to be expected, as the game is a fairly simple arcade game. There is one thing that I thought was interesting, and that's while there are some direct screenshots in the manual, there's also some pictures here that appear to be computer-rendered scenes to explain the goings-on, rather than hand-drawn artwork. It fits the graphical nature of the game, which was an early mix of 2D and 3D, so I don't have a problem with it, I just wasn't expecting to see it. Okay, that's the package for Bonanza Brothers. Let's start to dig in and maybe figure out some of the confusion around the story for the North American version. As mentioned, Bonanza Brothers, or Bonanza Bros to be technically correct, was originally an arcade game for Sega's System 24 hardware, which you might not be familiar with, as opposed to the previous System 16, which provided the inspiration for the Mega Drive. The System 24 was an arcade board that was released in 1988, a few years after the System 16. However, rather than specifically expanding on the System 16 like the System 18 did, the System 24 instead was designed to focus on higher resolution and higher color graphics. To this end, the System 24 had been beefed up to run displays of 496 by 384 instead of 320 by 224, and to be able to display 16,384 simultaneous colors, a 4-fold increase on the System 16/18 family. However, this was still during the time that Sega had 2 arcade board families, the System Series and the Super Scalar series, with the Super Scalar boards designed to run the more expensive arcade machines, until both series were finally combined with the System 32 hardware. Due to the System 18 and 24 being stepping stones towards that unified platform, Sega didn't release comparatively many arcade titles for those boards, and the System 24 specifically featured more releases after the release of the System 32 in Japan exclusively. I don't have data for that, but I'm going to assume that that was simply a cost-saving measure by Sega to use up existing hardware in Japan on titles that they weren't going to push worldwide, rather than actually a desire to use the platform. Anyway, all of that is a very long way of stating that that's probably part of the reason why Bonanza Bros wasn't a bigger hit or more well known, was because arcades at the time had to decide whether it was going to be worth it to pay new prices on a game that was essentially running on a souped up System 16, but then also throw in the extra expense of a medium resolution monitor instead of a standard resolution monitor. Again, I've got no hard evidence of any of this, but here's the list of the other System 24 games that were released worldwide. Hot Rod, Scramble Spirits, Gain Ground, Crackdown, and Super Masters. Of those games, how many can you honestly say where you've seen the arcade version? Personally, I do remember seeing Crackdown, but that's about it. If you've gotten to this part of the video, you might be wondering, Dave, Bonanza Bros was ported all over the place. What do you mean it wasn't a hit? And you're right, for whatever reason, not only did the game make appearances on the Genesis and Master System, it also made the rounds on all of the European 8 and 16-bit home computers, the Sharp X68000, and probably most bizarrely, a port to the PC Engine Super CD-ROM all the way in the fall of 1992. So, what's going on here? Well, while one of the considerations when licensing a title to port it to other platforms is its popularity, another is how complex is the game, and how difficult would it be to recreate the game for another console or computer. This, at least in part, is why I think you saw Bonanza Bros recreated on so many different platforms, because the game itself is pretty simple, and someone like US Gold would be able to have versions of the game created for even less powerful platforms like the Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC, and have the game at least still resemble the arcade original, if you squint a bit. Just don't look too close to that Spectrum port. It's rough, and that's all I'm going to say about that, at risk of starting a Spectrum Commodore holy war. Okay, so that explains the game's vast European presence, but what about that Sharp X68000 and Super CD port? Well, I think, and again, take this with a grain of salt, but Bonanza Bros was simply more popular in Japan, and that's why these two ports exist. Also, in case you're curious, that X68000 version is very impressive and amazingly close to the arcade, just throwing that out there. Getting back to Bonanza Bros being more popular in Japan though, my reason for saying that is because Bonanza Bros was the spiritual predecessor to another Sega series of games called Puzzle in Action, all three of which only appeared in Japan, and even with the change in title and plot, it's pretty easy to see why the games are connected. So I've beaten to death the idea that Bonanza Bros was somewhat of an underground title, at least in the United States anyway. But regardless of its overall popularity, what about this Genesis version that I'm supposed to be reviewing? Well, let's talk about that. The concept behind the game is one that I like, and it's actually very fitting of the 8 and 16-bit era. The game is a 1 or 2 player game, and it's based around you and possibly a friend taking control of the Bonanza brothers, Robo and Mobo, and pulling off heists to steal a predetermined amount of goods from different locations, like a casino, a jewelry store, and a cruise ship. Well, at least that's the story everywhere except for North America. This is what I was getting at in the previous section where we were looking at the front and rear cover of the game. In Sega of America's infinite wisdom, they decided to take the plot of an arcade game that had already been released in that region and play with it. The Bros, or Brothers, which I have to assume was renamed to try to capitalize on the name of a certain other popular series with brothers in the title, were also renamed to Spike and Mike, and now instead of just being well-known wanted criminals, they're apparently somehow reformed or white hat thieves that are hired by some unpictured and unknown guy to test the security at various locations that he owns. Never mind the fact that the North American cover still has them front and center on a wanted poster that has Dead or Alive on it. Like a lot of Sega of America decisions in the early 90s, this is yet another one that just doesn't make any damn sense. I'll forgive the new names, which I do think is actually an upgrade, but messing with the plot because you don't think it's kid-friendly enough in a game where you routinely knock out guard dogs with a stun gun is just weird. Other than messing around with the story, the port to the Genesis platform is actually pretty good. One issue when porting games that were originally designed for medium-resolution arcade monitors to home consoles, designed to be viewed on regular CRTs, is that they're simply never going to look as good. We've seen this before on the channel with something as simple as Paperboy, where having that extra resolution, even in a simple title, can make a lot of difference. This is especially true with Bonanza Brothers, where the game has a very specific geometric design scheme for not just the areas, but also the characters, that appear to have been modeled with early CGI tech. With designs like that especially, it just stands to reason that the game is going to look better the more pixels that you can throw at, to make the sprites that much closer to those original renders. Having said that though, I don't think the Genesis version specifically looks bad. Simple, sure, but the original arcade game wasn't that graphically impressive, and there's still lots of details that have been carried over in the port and the backgrounds, like say the paintings that represent the various Sega arcade titles in the art museum level, or the slot machines in the casino. And in fact, I would almost say that the Genesis port is too similar to the arcade version in one particular key area, and that is how the playable portion of the screen is displayed. When I booted up Bonanza Brothers for the first time, I immediately thought of Spy vs. Spy, and if you're not familiar with that series, I reviewed the Master System version back in episode 87 if you want to take a look. Regardless, with the game designed as a two-player game, the designers made the choice to allow players to explore the environment separately, and to that end, the game is displayed in a split screen, with one player at the top and one player at the bottom, split by a middle status ribbon. The only problem is, unlike a certain other Sega port of the game, which I'm not going to discuss because that will be its own review in 100 episodes from now, the game is always displayed in this view, even when you play the game in single-player mode, and in that case, a third of the screen gets forfeited to do effectively nothing. In the arcades, this isn't as big a deal due to having the extra screen resolution, but on the Genesis, it would have been really nice to have an alternate display mode that didn't waste all that space. One other small issue I have with the game, as pertains to the transition from the arcades, is that the game appears to be needlessly cut. The Genesis version has 10 missions to run through, and then you're done, meaning that good players are probably going to run through the whole game in about 25 minutes, and that's without speedrunning. With a game that short, you need as much content as possible. The arcade version had an introductory training level, 12 actual game levels, and then 3 small single-screen bonus levels, and I'm just scratching my head as to why they had to cut anything. The Genesis cartridge weighs in at 4 megabits, pretty standard for the Genesis at that point in time, but I have to question, bonus and training levels notwithstanding, could they really not fit the extra 2 levels in the game? If you're curious, the 2 missing levels are the department and antique stores. It's not the end of the world, but it does seem like a needless detraction. On the other side of the spectrum, one area where I was impressed with the port is in its sound. The music in the game is very impressive, and there's places where it sounds like the Sega teams that may have shared some of the synth samples between Bonanza Brothers and the original Sonic the Hedgehog. While the music and sound effects of course aren't quite as high quality as what's in the arcade original, they're still really good. And looking back at the schedule of games that have appeared on Season 5 of the channel, Bonanza Bros is probably going to stand as one of my favorite games of the year when it comes to sound. And that was completely not expected when I started this review. And the fact that the ha 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 voice sample when Mike or Spike grab one of the valuables in the level was brought over intact is just the icing on the cake. I mentioned earlier when going into this review that I knew nothing about Bonanza Brothers before this week. Thankfully, playing the game this week was quite enjoyable because even though the game definitely has some quirky design choices when it comes to the controls, once you get used to them, the game is pretty fun, with some nice level design and a good mix of enemies to try to either stun or avoid as you make your way through. And the game appears to be a solid port of the arcade version, minus the mentioned level cuts and lower resolution. Unfortunately, the game suffers from the same problem that many arcade ports have in its relatively short length, and then the Genesis version specifically has the needless self-inflicted wound of the edited story that literally no one cared about. As a result, I'm giving Bonanza Brothers for the Genesis 2 stars. That might seem a bit harsh, but it's just hard for me to overly recommend a game that you can be done with in 25 minutes, and then having no real reason to go back and play it again unless you're trying to set a high score. However, I do find it interesting, and if you've got one of the Sega arcade collections that has it, or perhaps the Genesis Mini 2, definitely give it a look, as I do think that you'll get some enjoyment out of it.
Okay, and that was Bonanza Brothers for the Genesis. Even though I didn't give the game the highest review score in the world, I want to be clear, that's more of an indictment on its short length rather than anything else. It's certainly not a bad game, and it's a very capable arcade port, even though it's being crammed into much less powerful hardware. This is a game that very much feels like a throwback game to the arcades of the 80s, and if you enjoy those types of games, I definitely recommend at least checking it out, especially if you're like me and missed it due to living in the United States. But maybe don't spend a bunch of money on collecting a copy. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's a first for the channel, as I'm looking at the first game in a series to appear for the Genesis, and I think it's actually pretty appropriate, considering the time of the year, due to both the series' long-standing history of Halloween specials and the content of the game involving fighting off space aliens. Next week, I'll see you in the treehouse. Ha ha ha. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 215. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.